Welcome to Sleepy Crimes. I am Anna, your host. Tonight, we drift into the shadows of the Arnold Rothstein murder. It is the 4th of November, 1928, in a New York City that feels draped in heavy, ink-colored velvet. The air is thick with the scent of wood smoke and the sharp, metallic tang of the coming winter. Imagine the city as it was then, a sprawling labyrinth of electric lights and deep, echoing canyons of stone. The wind whispers through the grid of Manhattan, carrying the muffled sounds of distant jazz and the rhythmic clatter of trolley cars on iron rails. We find ourselves standing outside the Park Central Hotel, a towering monument of luxury on 7th Avenue. Its windows glow like amber jewels against the dark sky, casting long, shimmering reflections across the damp pavement. Inside, the world is one of soft carpets and polished brass, but tonight, the shadows are stretching longer than usual, reaching into the hidden corners where the city's true power resides. Breathe in the cool, crisp air of that November night, and let your mind settle into the rhythm of a mystery that has never quite been solved. Earlier that evening, the heartbeat of the underworld could be felt at Lindy's restaurant. It was a place of bright, glaring lights and the comforting smell of salt beef and heavy rye bread. Arnold Rothstein, the man they called the Brain, sat at his customary table, a figure of absolute glacial calm. He was a man who moved the world with a whisper and a nod, his pockets filled with the heavy weight of a bankroll that could buy almost anyone in the city. At 10:15, the ringing of the telephone cut through the low hum of the dining room. It was a sharp, demanding sound that seemed to vibrate through the very floorboards. Rothstein answered it with his usual deliberate grace. The voice on the other end belonged to George McManus, a gambler who was currently sequestered in room 349 of the Park Central. When Rothstein returned to his table, he did something entirely uncharacteristic. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a long-barreled, pearl-handled pistol, handing it to his associate. "I will not be long," he murmured, his voice as smooth as polished stone. He stepped out into the night without his weapon, leaving the warmth of Lindy's for the biting chill of the street, walking toward a destiny that was waiting for him in the quiet halls of the hotel. The walk to the Park Central was short, yet every step seemed to echo with a strange finality. The lobby of the hotel was a sanctuary of opulence, where the air was perfumed with expensive tobacco and the rustle of silk. Rothstein moved through the crowd like a ghost, unnoticed by the socialites and travelers. He entered the elevator, the iron gate sliding shut with a heavy, rhythmic clang that resonated in the small space. As the carriage rose, the world of the lobby faded, replaced by the hushed, expectant silence of the upper floors. He stepped out onto the 3rd floor, where the carpets were so thick they swallowed the sound of his shoes entirely. The hallway was a long stretch of dim yellow light and shadow, the doors lined up like silent sentinels. He reached room 349, his hand hovering for a brief second over the cold, brass handle. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of spilled whiskey and the invisible weight of a debt that could not be paid. There were no witnesses to what happened behind that closed door, only the sudden, violent crack of a .38 caliber revolver that tore through the stillness of the hotel like a thunderclap in a small room. The bullet was a sudden, searing intrusion of heat. It struck him in the abdomen, a single, devastating jolt that shifted the world on its axis. Arnold Rothstein did not cry out. He was a man who had spent his life mastered by silence. Instead, he turned away from the room, his hand pressing firmly against the spreading warmth on his shirt. He did not return to the grand elevators or the golden lobby where he might have found help. Instead, he sought the shadows he knew so well. He stumbled through the narrow, clinical corridors used by the staff, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps that sounded like the rustle of dry leaves. The walls here were not covered in silk or paper, but were bare and cold to the touch. He groped his way along the service stairs, his fingers trailing against the rough, painted brick. Every movement was a battle against the encroaching darkness. He could smell the industrial soap and the cold, damp air rising from the basement. The opulence of the Park Central was only a few feet away, but in these back hallways, he was a man alone, bleeding out into the silence of a building that was designed to hide its labor from the eyes of the wealthy. He eventually reached the service entrance on 55th Street, a heavy, unadorned door that led to the alleyway and the cold night air. It was there, near the service elevator, that the world finally caught up with him. A hotel maid named Bridget Ferry was going about her nightly duties when she saw a figure slumped against the wall, a shadow that didn't belong in the orderly world of the hotel's staff. He was doubled over, his face as pale as the moon, his hand still clamped over the wound. When the alarm was raised, the quiet of the service entrance was shattered by the arrival of the authorities. Detective Patrick Floyd, a man who had crossed paths with Rothstein many times in the smoke-filled rooms of the city, was one of the first to arrive. He knelt beside the fallen gambler, the light from a bare bulb overhead casting harsh shadows across their faces. "Who shot you, Arnold?" Floyd asked, his voice low and urgent, almost a plea for the truth. But the man known as the Brain lived by a code that was older than the laws of the city. He looked up at the detective with eyes that were already beginning to cloud, a faint, weary smile touching his lips. "You know me better than that, Patty," he whispered, his voice a mere thread of sound against the cold concrete. Even as the ambulance arrived and the sirens began to wail through the quiet streets of Midtown, Rothstein remained a fortress of silence. He was carried out through the service entrance, the very same door used for laundry and refuse, a stark and lonely exit for the man who had once owned the city's nights. As the vehicle sped toward the hospital, the secret of who had pulled the trigger remained locked behind his teeth, protected by a stubborn, ancient loyalty to the silence of the underworld. The mystery began there, in the damp air of 55th Street, as the blood on the service entrance floor began to cool and the crowds began to gather behind the police tape. The king of the gamblers had played his final hand, and he chose to fold without showing his cards. "The case rests now. Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well." The wheels of the gurney clicked rhythmically against the cold linoleum tiles of Polyclinic Hospital, a sharp, metallic staccato that seemed to mark the remaining seconds of an empire. Arnold Rothstein lay beneath a heavy white sheet, his breath coming in shallow, ragged hitches that barely disturbed the fabric. The air here was thick with the scent of antiseptic, ether, and floor wax, a stark and clinical contrast to the tobacco-laden haze of the gambling dens and Broadway booths he had ruled for decades. Outside the high, soot-stained windows, the city of Manhattan hummed with a nervous, electric energy as the sun began to dip below the horizon on that first Sunday of November. A biting autumn wind rattled the glass panes, but inside the hospital room, time seemed to decelerate, stretching out like the long, distorted shadows cast by the setting sun. Nurses moved with ghostly quiet, their starched white caps flickering in the dim amber light of the hallway lamps like moths against a flame. The man known as the Brain, the orchestrator of impossible odds and the architect of 1,000 fixed games, was now at the mercy of a singular physical reality. A single bullet had torn through his abdomen, a messy, chaotic intrusion into a life defined by cold, mathematical calculation. Yet, even as his pulse weakened and the color drained from his face, his jaw remained set in a firm, unyielding line, a silent monument to the unwritten rules of the streets he had helped to build. In the hallway, detectives sat on hard wooden chairs, their heavy wool coats draped over their knees. The smell of damp wool and stale coffee clung to them like a second skin as they waited for a name, a clue, or a single word that would unravel the mystery of what had happened in room 349 of the Park Central Hotel. Every few hours, a plainclothes officer would lean over the bed, his face illuminated by the flickering glow of a single bedside lamp. He would whisper into Rothstein's ear, asking who had pulled the trigger, who had finally dared to strike at the king of the underworld. Rothstein would only turn his head away, his eyes fixed on the ceiling where the plaster was cracked into a jagged map of forgotten territories. When pressed, his voice was nothing more than a dry rasp, like the sound of dead leaves skittering across a sidewalk. He told them to stick to their trade, and he would stick to his. The code of silence was not just a rule for him. It was his last remaining asset, $1 million secret he refused to spend. The silence in the room was heavy, almost physical, weighing down on the lungs of everyone present. It was the silence of a vault, locked from the inside, containing the secrets of the Black Sox scandal and the names of every politician whose palm had been greased with his gold. He was a man who had made a career out of knowing things others did not, and he intended to keep that advantage until the very end. Beyond the hospital walls, the city was a cauldron of political fervor. It was the eve of Election Day, 1928, and the names of Herbert Hoover and Al Smith were being shouted from every street corner. Radios crackled with the latest polls, and the gutters were littered with discarded flyers and the ash of celebratory cigars. New York was a city of divided loyalties, but inside the private suite, the only loyalty that mattered was the one Rothstein held to his own legend. His mistress, the Ziegfeld dancer Inez Norton, arrived with the soft rustle of silk and the faint, sweet scent of French perfume that seemed to momentarily mask the smell of medicine. She sat by his side, her gloved hand resting gently on his cold skin. The contrast was striking, the vibrant, polished beauty of a woman in her prime and the fading shadow of a man who had once been the most powerful figure in the city. Nearby, his estranged wife, Carolyn, waited in the shadows, a silent witness to the collision of his two worlds. The rhythmic ticking of a clock on the wall became the heartbeat of the room, each second a precious drop of time slipping through his fingers. The shadows lengthened, creeping across the floor like ink spilled on a pristine white tablecloth, swallowing the corners of the room in a velvety, obsidian embrace that felt like the coming of a long, deep sleep. As the sun rose on Tuesday, November 6, 1928, the first voters began to line up at the polling stations across the 5 boroughs. The city was alive with the sound of democracy, a cacophony of voices and footsteps that seemed a world away from the hushed, sterile atmosphere of the polyclinic. Rothstein's condition had worsened significantly overnight. His skin had taken on the pallor of aged parchment, and his eyes, once sharp and piercing as a hawk's, were now clouded and distant. The internal bleeding was a slow, invisible tide, pulling him further away from the shore of the living with every passing hour. Doctors moved about with a sense of resigned professionalism, checking his vitals and adjusting the bandages that were now stained a deep, dark crimson. There was no surgery that could repair the damage done to his spirit. The bullet had done its work, not just tearing through flesh, but severing the delicate threads that held his vast, shadow empire together. Outside, the newsboys were already shouting the early headlines, their voices carrying through the crisp autumn air. The world was moving on, preparing for a new leader and a new era, while the man who had shaped the underworld of the past decade lay fading in the quiet, gray light of a Tuesday morning, his influence evaporating like mist in the morning sun. In those final hours, the detectives made one last, desperate attempt to break the wall of silence. They leaned in close, their breath hot against his cooling skin, pleading for the name of his assassin so that justice could be served. Rothstein looked at them, a ghost of a smile touching his bloodless lips. He whispered that his mother had done it, a final, cryptic deflection that left the investigators frustrated and empty-handed. He was dying as he had lived, by the odds, and the odds now dictated that he take his secrets to the grave. He had bet over $500,000 on the election of Herbert Hoover, a wager he would never collect. The light in the room began to fail, not because the day was ending, but because his own internal sun was setting behind the horizon of his consciousness. The sounds of the city, the honking of horns, the distant cheers from the election crowds, and the whistle of the wind all began to merge into a single, low-frequency hum. It was the sound of the universe returning to a state of rest. At approximately 10:15 in the morning, the rhythmic rise and fall of his chest finally ceased. The silence that followed was absolute, a profound and heavy stillness that filled the room from floor to ceiling. The brain had stopped thinking. The fix was over. As the nurses pulled the sheet over his face, the city outside was already recording the first returns of the election, unaware that the true architect of its hidden history had finally, and permanently, closed his eyes. The air in the room was a heavy, stagnant soup of blue-gray smoke, swirling in the dim light of a low-hanging brass chandelier. It was September 8th, 1928, and the apartment of Jimmy Meehan on the west side had become a world unto itself, detached from the rhythmic ticking of the city outside. For 3 long days and 3 weary nights, the sun had risen and set behind heavy, velvet drapes that remained tightly drawn, sealing in the scent of stale whiskey, expensive Havana cigars, and the salt-sour sweat of men who had forgotten the meaning of sleep. The green felt of the poker table was no longer pristine. It was littered with the ash of 1,000 cigarettes and the ivory-white glint of poker chips that moved back and forth in a rhythmic, soul-crushing tide. Arnold Rothstein sat at the center of this orbit, his face a mask of pale ivory, his eyes hooded and dark like 2 polished stones. The only sound was the rhythmic snap of cards being shuffled, a sharp, dry sound that echoed against the wood-paneled walls like the clicking of a clock counting down to something inevitable. You can almost feel the grit of the dust on the table and the heavy, humid heat of the room, where time had ceased to exist for the men hunched over their cards. Around the table sat a collection of the most dangerous minds in the underworld. There was Nate Raymond, a man known for an icy composure that never wavered, even as the stakes climbed into the hundreds of thousands. Beside him sat the legendary Alvin Thompson, known to everyone as Titanic, whose long, slender fingers handled the deck with a fluid, almost supernatural grace. Every movement in the room was slow, deliberate, and laden with the weight of exhaustion. The players watched each other's eyes for the slightest flicker of a nerve, the smallest tremor in a hand reaching for a glass of water. Rothstein, the man they called the Brain, usually moved the strings of the city with a detached precision. But here, in the dim glow of the apartment, he found himself ensnared in a web he could not calculate his way out of. The silence was absolute, broken only by the occasional clink of a glass or the soft thud of a new deck being placed on the felt. Outside, New York moved through its routines, but inside this room, a financial catastrophe was unfolding in slow motion, card by card, hour by agonizing hour. As the third day bled into the final hours, the stakes had risen to heights that made the very air feel thin and electric. Rothstein's pile of markers grew taller, a paper monument to a losing streak that seemed to defy the very laws of probability he had spent his life mastering. By the time the final tallies were whispered into the silence, the number was staggering. Arnold Rothstein had lost $322,000. It was a sum so vast it seemed abstract, yet the physical markers sat there, undeniable and cold. He owed Nate Raymond $219,000, Joe Bernstein $73,000, and Titanic Thompson $30,000. For any other man, this would be the end of a life, but for Rothstein, it was a challenge to his ego. He stared at the cards scattered across the felt, his mind replaying the hands with a surgical intensity. A dark realization began to settle in his chest, heavier than the fatigue of 72 hours without rest. He began to suspect that the cards had not fallen by chance, but by design. The accusation, when it finally hung in the air, was not shouted. It was breathed out like a curse into the smoke-filled room. Rothstein believed the game was rigged. He believed he had been cold-decked, a term for the treacherous introduction of a prearranged deck of cards at a critical moment. He looked at George McManus, the host who had organized the marathon session, and saw only a carefully constructed blankness. Rothstein stood up, his joints stiff and protesting, and straightened his silk tie with trembling hands. He told the men gathered there that he would not honor the debt. Not yet. He claimed he needed to investigate the fairness of the play, stalling for time by promising to pay only after the November elections, when he expected a massive windfall from political bets. He walked out of the apartment and into the crisp, morning air of Manhattan, leaving behind a room full of men who lived by a code, where a gambling debt was more sacred than a blood oath. The silence he left in his wake was not a peace, but a brewing storm that would soon break over the city. In the weeks following that fateful game, the investigation would later piece together how the tension shifted from the poker table to the dark corners of the city's gambling dens. Detectives, working through a wall of silence, found records of increasingly frantic phone calls and whispered threats directed at the man who refused to pay. George McManus was under immense pressure. As the host, he was held responsible for the behavior of the guests and the collection of the pots. The $300,000 debt became a shadow that followed Rothstein through the streets, darkening every doorway he entered. His creditors were not men of patience, and they viewed his refusal as a crack in the foundation of the entire underworld system. Every time Rothstein entered Lindy's restaurant or walked past the bright lights of Broadway, the eyes of the city were on him, waiting to see if the great gambler could bluff his way out of a debt written in ink and backed by the threat of lead. The investigation revealed that the invitation to the Park Central Hotel on that November evening was the final move in a game that had really ended 2 months prior, in the smoke and shadows of a 3-day game. The air inside the New York courtroom in December of 1929 was heavy with more than just the usual winter dampness. It was a thick, cloying atmosphere, smelling of wet wool, radiator steam, and the faint, metallic scent of tobacco that clung to the lapels of the city's most notorious men. George McManus, known to the underworld as Hump, sat at the defense table with a composure that bordered on the spectral. He was a large man, yet in the dimly lit chambers of justice, he seemed to recede into the shadows of his own reputation. Outside the tall, arched windows, the city was a gray smudge of slush and iron, but inside, the focus was narrowed to a single, haunting piece of fabric. The trial had become a spectacle, drawing an eclectic crowd that seemed plucked from the very pages of the fiction Arnold Rothstein had lived. Among the spectators sat the Lord Bishop of Aberdeen in his black knee breeches and gaiters, and the prolific crime writer Edgar Wallace, his eyes darting across the room as if searching for a plot twist that the legal system could not provide. The silence in the room was not a peaceful one. It was a pressurized void, a collective holding of breath by a city that knew the truth but was terrified to speak it aloud. The wood of the benches groaned under the weight of gamblers, fixers, and silent observers, all waiting to see if the law could finally pierce the veil of the code of silence that Rothstein had nurtured even as his life ebbed away on a hospital cot. At the center of the prosecution's crumbling case lay the ghost of an overcoat. It had been found in room 349 of the Park Central Hotel, draped over a chair like a discarded skin. The room had been rented under the false name of George Richards, a pseudonym as thin and transparent as the winter ice on the Hudson. When the police stepped over the threshold into that room, they found 2 flasks, one still half filled with the golden, biting scent of whiskey, and glasses that caught the dim light of the hallway. But it was the coat that spoke. Tucked into the inner lining, stitched with meticulous, dark thread, was the name McManus. It was a piece of evidence that seemed to scream a confession, yet it sat on the evidence table now, limp and hollow. The prosecution theorized that in the frantic, heart-pounding moments after the single shot from the .38 caliber revolver had been fired, a panicked McManus had grabbed the wrong garment. He had allegedly fled into the night wearing Arnold Rothstein's own overcoat, leaving his identity behind in a tangle of silk and wool. Beneath the window of that room, on the cold pavement of 7th Avenue, a taxi driver named Al Bender had discovered the murder weapon, a snub-nosed revolver that looked small and insignificant against the vastness of the crime. The jury looked at the coat, and then at the man, but the connection between the two was beginning to fray. The fabric was real, the stitching was permanent, but the narrative was dissolving into the misty uncertainties of the underworld. One by one, the witnesses were called to the stand, a parade of men whose livelihoods depended on the calculated risks of the card table and the shadows of the betting parlor. Titanic Thompson, the legendary hustler who had seen more than his share of blood and bills, walked to the stand with a crooked, knowing smile. His testimony was a masterpiece of selective amnesia. He spoke of the great game, of the hundreds of thousands of dollars in debts that Rothstein had refused to pay. But when it came to the night of the shooting, his memory became a shifting fog. He called McManus a swell loser, a man who would never resort to the crude finality of a bullet over a poker debt. Others followed, their voices low and rhythmic, repeating the same rehearsed phrases of uncertainty. Abe Schur, the cashier from Lindy's who had seen Rothstein take the fateful phone call, suddenly found his certainty wavering. The prosecution's case was like a house of cards built in a gale. Each man who took the oath seemed to be looking not at the judge, but at the empty chair where Arnold Rothstein should have been, or perhaps at the invisible figures in the back of the room who enforced the law of the street. The district attorney, Joab Banton, watched with growing exasperation as his witnesses recanted, softened their edges, and looked through him as if he were a ghost. The code of the street was proving more powerful than the laws of the state, and the silence was becoming deafening, a thick wool blanket thrown over the mouth of the truth. By the time the trial reached its conclusion in the final weeks of the year, the weight of the empty overcoat was all that remained. Judge Charles C. Knott Jr. looked down from his bench at the assembly of quiet men and fragmented evidence. He saw a prosecution that could not prove Rothstein had ever even entered room 349 that night. No trail of blood marked the carpeted halls of the Park Central. No witness would place the defendant's hand on the trigger. The judge's voice was dry as parchment when he addressed the jury, directing them to acquit George McManus. He noted that the law required more than a misplaced coat and a handful of whispers to take a man's liberty. As the words echoed through the wood-paneled room, a soft murmur rippled through the gallery, not of surprise, but of a grim, shared understanding. McManus walked free into the biting cold of 1929, leaving the mystery of the empty overcoat behind him in the stale air of the courtroom. The case was officially closed, yet it remained as open as a fresh wound. The gambler's code had held firm, and the man who had fixed the world had, in death, fixed his own final silence. As the lights in the courthouse were extinguished one by one, the city outside continued its frantic, rhythmic pulse, unbothered by the fact that a killer walked among the shadows, and the name stitched in a discarded coat was all that justice would ever have to hold on to. The silence that followed the acquittal of George McManus was not the peaceful kind. It was heavy, like the air before a summer storm, thick with the scent of ozone and the damp pavement of 7th Avenue. In the wake of the trial, the empire Arnold Rothstein had meticulously built began to fray at the edges, its golden threads unraveling in the hands of those he had once mentored. The man they called the Brain was gone, but his presence lingered in every smoky corner of Lindy's restaurant. His customary table stood empty now, the white linen cloth seemingly brighter, colder, under the low amber glow of the hanging lamps. The waiters moved past it with a hushed reverence, as if expecting the phantom of a man in a perfectly pressed tuxedo to suddenly appear, checking his pocket watch with a quiet, knowing smile. Outside, the city of New York continued its restless churn, but the underworld felt a sudden, chilling draft. The big bankroll was no longer there to bridge the gaps between the street gangs and the high society politicians. The mediator, the fixer, the man who had turned chaos into a corporate ledger, had left a vacuum so vast it threatened to swallow the very streets he once owned. Younger men watched from the shadows, their eyes sharp and hungry. Among them was Charles Luciano, whom the world would soon know as Lucky. He remembered the lessons Rothstein had imparted, not in dark alleys, but in the hushed aisles of high-end department stores. Arnold had once taken the young, rough-edged immigrant by the arm and guided him toward the finest wools and silks, teaching him that power was not just found in the weight of a lead pipe, but in the drape of an impeccable suit and the steady, unblinking gaze of a businessman. Rothstein had been the one to whisper that the future of crime lay not in thievery, but in organization. As the winter of 1928 bled into 1929, Luciano and his companion Mayor Lansky began to see the blueprint Rothstein had left behind. It was a map of a new world, one where the old, blood-soaked feuds of the old-world gangsters, the mustache Petes, were replaced by boards of directors and shared interests. They sat in dimly lit rooms, the air thick with the sweet, cloying smell of expensive cigars, and spoke in low tones about the necessity of a syndicate. They were the heirs to a ghost, and they were ready to claim his throne. The ghost of the 1919 World Series still drifted through the conversations of these young titans. To Rothstein, fixing the series hadn't just been about a massive payout of $350,000. It had been an exercise in removing chance from the equation. He hated luck. He craved certainty. This philosophy became the bedrock of the new organization. Luciano and Lansky realized that if they could organize the bootlegging routes, the gambling dens, and the narcotics trade with the same clinical precision Rothstein had used to manipulate the baseball diamond, they could build something immortal. But first, the old guard had to be dealt with. The city was a powder keg of traditionalist bosses who still believed in territory defined by heritage rather than profit. Without Rothstein to mediate, the streets began to whisper of a coming war. The rain slicked the cobblestones of the Lower East Side, reflecting the neon signs of a changing era, and in every doorway, the click of a lighter or the rustle of a heavy overcoat signaled a shift in the wind. The corporate model of crime was no longer a suggestion. It was a survival tactic. As the investigation into Rothstein's murder stalled, his personal effects were slowly picked over. There were rumors of safe deposit boxes that, if opened, would cause a wave of suicides among the city's elite. People spoke of lists of judges, commissioners, and senators who were all deeply indebted to the big bankroll. The mystery of his death became a shield for those who stepped into his shoes. While the police looked for a gunman, Luciano and his associates were looking at the ledger. They began to divide the city, not into ethnic enclaves, but into revenue streams. The shadow of Rothstein's empire was long, stretching across the Atlantic and into the very heart of the American dream. The transition was subtle at first, a handshakes in a back room here, a diverted shipment of scotch there, but the pulse of the city was changing. The era of the individual kingpin was dying, and the age of the commission was being born in the cold, quiet hours of the night. You can almost hear the soft scratching of a fountain pen on parchment, a sound more dangerous than any gunshot, as the new order was signed into existence. By the time the final leaves of 1929 had fallen, the landscape of organized crime had been irrevocably altered. The man who had refused to name his killer on his deathbed had achieved a strange kind of immortality through his absence. His wealth, once estimated in the millions, seemed to vanish into the fog of legal disputes and hidden accounts, leaving behind only the cold, hard logic of his methods. The younger generation didn't just inherit his rackets. They inherited his brain. They understood now that a true empire is built on the shadows it casts, and Arnold Rothstein's shadow was the largest the city had ever seen. As the streetlights flicker and the fog rolls in from the harbor, one can almost imagine him still there, standing on the corner of 49th and Broadway, watching the world he created move forward without him. The power vacuum was filled not with blood, but with the quiet, terrifying efficiency of a corporation. The empire was gone, but the syndicate was just beginning to breathe. Feel the coolness of the night air, the steady rhythm of the city's heart, and the lingering echo of a man who knew that in the end, everything can be fixed if you only know where to place the bet. The air in the New York Polyclinic Hospital was thick with the sharp, clinical sting of carbolic acid and the heavy, stagnant silence of a winter night in 1928. In room 349, the man they called the Brain lay remarkably still. The flickering yellow light from a street lamp filtered through the frosted glass of the window, casting long, skeletal shadows across the white linen sheets. Arnold Rothstein, the man who had moved the world with a whisper and a wager, was fading. Outside, the city hummed with the distant rattle of elevated trains and the rhythmic clip-clop of horse-drawn carriages, but inside this room, time had slowed to the labored, shallow rhythm of a dying man's breath. Detectives leaned close, their faces etched with a desperate, hungry curiosity. They smelled of stale tobacco and wet wool, their notebooks open, pencils poised to catch a single name. Who shot you, Arnold? The question hung in the air, heavy and unanswered. Rothstein's eyes, usually as sharp and cold as polished flint, remained fixed on the ceiling. With a final, ghostly flicker of the wit that had outmaneuvered the most powerful men in the country, he whispered a few words that would echo through the decades. He told them his mother had done it. He told them to stick to their trade, while he stuck to his. Even as his heart faltered, he remained a man of his word, or perhaps more accurately, a man of his silence. He was taking the secrets of the underworld, the ledgers of the politicians, and the truth of that final hotel room meeting into the quiet earth of Union Field Cemetery. By December of 1929, the search for justice had moved from the hospital bed to the grand, echoing halls of the courtroom. The trial of George McManus, the man the state was certain had pulled the trigger over a $320,000 poker debt, felt more like a choreographed play than a pursuit of truth. The benches were made of heavy, dark mahogany, polished until they gleamed like the surface of a deep, still pond. The air was cold, smelling of damp umbrellas and the faint, sweet scent of hair tonic. Witness after witness took the stand, their voices trembling or curiously flat, as they suffered from a sudden and profound loss of memory. They could not remember the faces in the hallway of the Park Central Hotel. They could not recall the sound of the shot. The prosecution's case, built on a foundation of circumstantial shadows and a discarded overcoat with a name stitched into the lining, began to crumble like dry parchment. When the judge finally directed the jury to acquit McManus for a total lack of evidence, a strange, knowing sigh rippled through the gallery. It was as if the city itself knew that Arnold's world operated under a different set of laws, unwritten, unspoken, and utterly unbreakable. The verdict was not just a legal conclusion. It was the final period on a sentence Arnold had started writing years before. The murder would remain officially unsolved, a ghost story whispered in the back booths of Lindy's Deli, while the man they called Hump walked free into the gray New York afternoon. In the months following the funeral, a different kind of mystery began to unfold, the mystery of the big bankroll's vanishing empire. For years, the public believed Rothstein was a man of infinite wealth, a financier who kept millions tucked away in hidden safes and secret accounts across the globe. But as his brother, Harry, and his lawyers began to sift through the mountains of paperwork, they found not a fortress of gold, but a labyrinth of debt and hollow promises. They opened heavy iron safes to find them filled with nothing but dust and old correspondence. They traced lines of credit that led only to bankrupt bootleggers and politicians who had suddenly forgotten their debts. The grand estate, once estimated at millions of dollars, was eventually declared insolvent. It was the ultimate gambler's trick. Arnold had lived his life on the edge of a blade, projecting an image of absolute stability while moving money like a master of sleight of hand. He was a man who owned everything on paper and nothing in reality. His true wealth was never in the bank. It was in the influence he wielded and the fear he inspired. As the legal battles over his will dragged on, his mistress and his wife fought over a legacy that was rapidly turning to ash. The man who had treated crime like a modern corporation had left behind a ledger that simply would not balance, leaving the world to wonder if the big bankroll had ever truly existed at all, or if he was merely a ghost created by the collective imagination of a city obsessed with the thrill of the take. Though his money vanished, his fingerprints remained indelibly pressed into the very architecture of organized crime. In the shadows of his passing, a new generation of men stepped forward, men like Charles Lucky Luciano and Mayer Lansky. They were the boys Arnold had groomed, the protégés he had taught to trade their rough wool caps for silk fedoras and their street brawls for board meetings. Luciano would never forget the lessons in etiquette, the way Arnold insisted on custom-tailored suits and the quiet dignity of a gentleman. He had shown them that a criminal did not need to be a thug. He needed to be a businessman who understood the cold, hard truths of supply and demand. The transition was seamless. The chaotic, bloody wars of the old-world gangs were replaced by the calculated, corporate efficiency of the Commission. Arnold had provided the blueprint for a national syndicate, a web of influence that stretched from the docks of New York to the gambling dens of the West Coast. When you look at the towering casinos of Las Vegas or the intricate heroin trade of the mid-20th century, you are looking at the harvest of the seeds Arnold sowed. He transformed the underworld into a shadow version of the American dream, where profit was the only morality and the ledger was the only Bible. He was the dark architect of a new age, a man who realized that if you fixed the game well enough, the house would always win, even if the house eventually collapsed in upon itself. Today, the name Arnold Rothstein belongs more to mythology than to history. He is the inspiration for the sill-crapped shadows of fiction, the man who fixed the World Series of 1919 and lived to tell the tale, or rather, to keep the secret. He is the ghost of Broadway, a figure perpetually standing on a rain-slicked corner at midnight, checking a gold pocket watch that never stops ticking. The theories about his death continue to swirl like autumn leaves in a drafty alleyway. Was it a drunkard's mistake, a calculated hit by Dutch Schultz, or a sacrifice made to protect the secrets of the powerful? We may never know the truth of that night in room 349, and perhaps that is exactly how Arnold wanted it. He lived a life of calculated risks and hidden hands, and his death was the final, perfect gamble. As the city lights flicker and the world outside sinks into the quiet embrace of the night, the image of the man in the Oxford gray suit fades into the mist. He remains a reminder that the most dangerous secrets are the ones that are never told, and the most powerful men are the ones who know when to walk away from the table. The case rests now. Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well.